Everyone I interview the same introductory question. Can you introduce yourself and say what it is that you are known for?
I'm Robby London. I don't know that I'm known for anything, but I worked for many years in the entertainment industry, mostly in television, although a couple of feature films as well. As a writer, as a producer, as an executive, studio executive, in a couple of cases as a songwriter.
What is your earliest memory of film or television, whichever one comes first?
Probably TV, probably the Mickey Mouse Club, which was an early Walt Disney series. I think it was on every day, and I was pretty obsessed with it. A couple other things, a series called Sky King, The Lone Ranger, and probably one show that I was I was obsessed with as a child was the Disney version of Zorro, which coincidentally had an impact on my career later in life.
What kind of hobbies did you have growing up?
Well, my first hobby was probably fencing. I was so obsessed with Zorro that my parents actually gave me fencing lessons when I was very, very young, maybe 6, 7 years old. And so I did that as a young child. I think the next hobby I had was magic. I was really into that. Very briefly into stamp collecting. God knows why. Even then I didn't quite understand its appeal, but somehow I did it briefly. Baseball. I was obsessed with baseball from around 9 to 13. And then the music bug bit me, and playing music and writing music, and that really has stayed with me the rest of my life.
What kind of music did you initially get interested in and initially compose?
Well, I started taking guitar lessons in the year just before the Beatles hit America. So I mean, I wanted to play guitar, and I was playing pop rock music then. And when the Beatles hit, which was late 1963, it was truly like pouring gasoline on a match. I mean, I already sort of liked playing anyway, but the Beatles just absolutely grabbed me like many others. But I was already playing guitar at the time, so I became truly obsessed with Beatles music and copying it and playing the records at slow speed to learn every lick and everything about the Beatles. I was just and I'm to this day it's one of the few subjects that I will admit to being an expert to. I'm hugely knowledgeable about everything to do with the Beatles and their music. And then, all the British invasion groups that followed the Beatles, really all the music from about 63 to about 70, I was just all over it. I mean, that was how I spent my life other than going to school, was listening to the radio and listening to records and figuring out how to play all these songs.
Speaking of school, what was your formal education?
Well, high school and college. I actually went to 4 colleges and managed to get a BA in 3.5 years doing that by learning how to work the system to my advantage, which was another great training for my later career. Learning to manipulate the system to one's advantage is an important skill to have in Hollywood. So, I went through several majors. Economics at first. I wanted to be a radical economist and quickly grew very bored with that idea. Then music. I was a music major for a while, and I ended up as a psychology major graduating from University of Michigan. I went to 3 other University of Californias prior to going to University of Michigan.
Did you grow up in California?
Yes, I did.
So after you got your degree, what was the first job you had?
Well, there was a period after I got my degree. I was working for the university on a 24-hour counseling line, crisis line, and it was a paying job, and I loved it. And University of Michigan was in Ann Arbor, Michigan, which I just absolutely loved living there. It was a great time to be there. So after I graduated, I stayed there for a couple of years and just worked this job, which was fantastic because you could schedule flexible hours and work as much or as little as you want. And if you wanted to take off and go traveling, they didn't care as long as the hours got covered. In other words, the only thing they cared about was hours being covered by the various employees, and so you just would swap hours and things. So it was this wonderful gig where basically it was like being a college student without having the obligation of going to school, but getting all the benefits of living in a college community and all that. Anyway, after a couple of years of that, I decided to move back to L.A. to pursue my songwriting career. That was always my passion, was songwriting. And so I didn't really have a job when I went back to L.A., but I had a series of small jobs. I worked as a script reader doing synopses and coverage for producers where they have too much to read or they're too lazy to read, one or the other, or both. And so they hire people to just read scripts and fill out these summary forms about them and evaluate them. So that was one, but they were mostly part-time jobs, those jobs, and piecemeal jobs. So I did that. I worked as an accompanist for singing classes where people would come into singing classes and they didn't play an instrument, so I would back them up on the things they wanted to sing. I worked in radio as first a call screener, then a guest booker for the Top Talk radio show in LA, which was a really, really fun job, but it wasn't really a career. So those were all sort of part-time jobs that all sort of combined to keep me afloat while I, tried futilely to make a living in music. And so my first real job, I have to say, came after several years of this. My first real job was actually at Filmation in animation as a staff writer, which is a pretty amazing first real job to have.
How'd you get that job?
I had a lot of friends from high school that were trying to be screenwriters, oddly. And because I had worked as a reader, and also just because of my general sensibilities, a lot of them relied on me for advice and to read their stuff and to give them ideas. And one friend in particular literally twisted my arm to co-write with him. I didn't really think of myself as a writer other than songs. In terms of writing scripts, it didn't really interest me. I didn't really think that was my thing, but I knew a lot about it, and I gave a lot of advice. So this one friend literally made me co-write something with him, and we co-wrote something. We co-wrote a couple of things. We couldn't sell them, of course. We didn't make any money, but we finished them, and I was happy with the process, and that convinced me that maybe actually I was a writer after all. And then I had another friend that was working at Hanna-Barbera at the time, which was an animation studio, as a staff writer, and he'd been there a couple years. And he was burnt out as a writer, but he was being paid every week to generate scripts. And he got to the place where he just couldn't stand it anymore. So he called me, and he knew that I had done some writing. And he called me up and he said, "I want to make you an offer." He said, "I will pay you $500. I have a script due on Monday." He would call me on Friday. He said, "I have a script due on Monday. I can't do it. I'm just burnt out. I'll pay you $500. I'll give you the approved premise and outline. You write the script, and I'll take credit for it. You'll be my ghostwriter." And I had nothing going on at the time, and I really needed the money. So I said, "Sure, great." And I did it, and it worked out really well. Next Friday, he called me up. He said, "I've got another script. I'm really burnt out. You want to do the same thing?" I said, "Sure, great." Did it again. He was happy with it. The network approved it. It went through. And third Friday, he called me up and said, "You want to do it again?" I said, "Yeah. This time it's going to be $1,000, and I want shared credit." And he said, "Okay." So that's kind of how I got into animation writing. And then my friend Andy Hayward, whom I'd known since I was a teenager, was working at Filmation as a staff writer. And the head of writing at Filmation was a guy named Arthur Nadel. Mm-hmm. And they were looking for new writers. They were always trying to develop and discover new writers. And he asked Andy. He'd known Andy through Andy's father. Andy was a family friend, and that's how Andy got his job there. And he asked Andy if he knew anybody to recommend, and Andy was kind enough to recommend me. So the way Arthur worked is you would get hired at Filmation. You'd go in, and you'd get hired for one day to be on staff, one day. And they have regular working hours there. It was a union shop, and writers were under the union. So it would start at 8:30. There'd be a coffee break at 10:30, a lunch break for an hour at 12:30, and then you were done at 5:30, and that was it. So I was hired for one day, and my job was to write premises for one of the new series that they had just gotten picked up by the network. And the series turned out to be Zorro, which had been my absolute passion as a child. So when I first walked into Arthur's office and he said, "We're doing a new series called Zorro. Do you know anything about it?" And I said, "Yeah, I know a little something about it. Let me add it." So I wrote premises that day and turned them into Arthur at the end of the day. And he read them over and he said, yeah, these are pretty good. He said, "Do you want to work another day tomorrow?" And I said, "Yeah, that'd be great." This was a Monday. It started on a Monday. He said, "You want to work tomorrow, Tuesday?" I said, "Yeah, God, I'd love to." He said, "Okay, come on back. You're on for another day." So the same thing. I come back. I write some more premises. I turn them in. He looks at me. He says, "Yeah, these are good. You want to work another day tomorrow, Wednesday?" And I said, "Yeah." I come back on Wednesday just for the day, and Same thing, end of the day, he says, you want to work the rest of the week through Friday? I said, sure. So now I'd gotten 2 days. And it sort of it went on like that for maybe 2 or 3 weeks, where I was just getting hired a bit at a time with no commitment at all. And I felt it was just dependent on my work each day. It was a lot of pressure, to be honest. But it was fun, too. And finally, at the end of a couple of weeks, I guess I can't remember exactly. I guess hired me for a few more weeks at a time. And then ultimately, after a few weeks, he called me and he just said, I think I said to him, how much longer can I work here or something like that. And I'd really started to develop a bond with him. I really, really liked him, and I think he liked me, and we just clicked. And he said to me, Robby, I just want you to know, as long as I've got a job here, you've got a job here. And I thought to myself, I'd spent my whole 20s, my whole decade in my 20s, trying to get somebody to hire me in that way and to show confidence in me. And it was just an amazing, amazing moment in my life and my career to have this guy basically say, I think you're great and you're hired. And so that was my start at Filmation. And that was my first, as I say, my first real full-time job.
What year was that?
Well, it was 1980. Ironically, right before I worked at Filmation, I'd been working part-time at the radio station booking guests on a talk show, which I really enjoyed. That was a really, really fun job, super fun job. It was just part-time, though, and I ultimately got laid off from it. But one of the things I applied to do at that time was to work on a brand new show that had just been announced. It hadn't been on the air yet, called Entertainment Tonight. This was in 1980, and I sent my resume in, and this to me at the time would have been an absolute, total dream job. It was everything I wanted. I mean, other than being a songwriter, which I'd given up on at that point. But in terms of any other job, this would have been the thing I wanted the most. And after working about 6 months at Filmation and things going really well for me there, I got a call from Entertainment Tonight, and they asked me to come in. And I did. I just went in for an interview. I didn't, I wasn't going to give up my job at Filmation just like that, but I was just curious. And I went in and I got an interview with the executive producer of Entertainment Tonight. This was dawn. I don't think it hadn't gone on the air yet. And it was a very different vibe than it wasn't so, the whole pop culture thing that we have today in 2020, it wasn't anything like that in 1980. I mean, it was more like a real news magazine about the entertainment business. So it was interesting to me, and I actually got offered a job there while I had this job at Filmation. And it was a very, very hard decision to make because things had been going so well for me at Filmation, and I was so happy there. But Entertainment Tonight was kind of more interesting to me. So it was one of those great crossroad moments in life where you have to make a very hard choice where the road diverges. And so I ultimately opted to stay at Filmation. And retrospectively, I feel that was a good choice for me.
Well, world we would live in if you were working with Mary Hart and Tesh.
Yeah, exactly. But I think this was I'm not sure, you probably know. I think this was were they the first ones?
Mary Hart would have been 82. Tesh, I think, would have been 81 or 82.
Yeah, well, this was 80. I think this was even before them, honestly. I think it was before them. And it wasn't quite as glossy when it first started.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, yeah, it's the road not taken.
Do you remember what those pitches you initially did for Zorro were? Any of them?
You mean stories?
Yeah, and for the record, what exactly did writing a pitch in story entail?
I mean, a pitch is a fair description, but the actual formal name that was used in those days was premise, story premise, or just premise. And it was a pitch for an episode. And it was basically one page double-spaced, typically. Could be a little more, could be a little less. And the secret to writing good premises, and I sort of had learned this from my brief experiences at Hanna Barbera. I passed over, but the person at Hanna Barbera I was ultimately offered a gig as an apprentice at Hanna Barbera, and they were starting a new writer's apprentice program. It was brand new, and I was one of the first 3 writers put in it, thanks to my contact there, and that lasted, I think, all of 2 months before they just canceled out the program. So literally, it was canceled before I could do anything. But I picked up some knowledge about the whole business from my contact at Hanna Barbera and from my doing the ghostwriting there and stuff. So one thing I knew about, or either I had been trained or I instinctively knew, was how to write premises. And the key to writing good premises, there's two keys. One, believe it or not, is just have a catchy title. And two is sort of to top load the premise in terms of the first few sentences have to be punchy, interesting, and fascinating, and really go into enough detail to sound unique, and then you really compress all the rest of it so it doesn't go longer than a page. If you put too much detail in the premise, it sounds boring. It doesn't, that shorter format doesn't support a lot of detail. So whatever detail you're going to put in, you kind of front load with the premise. Anyway, I seem to have a knack for it. And do I remember any of the stories? I kind of only remember one, and it was a good one, and I think it might have been one of the ones I did the first day, and it was one that ultimately they submitted to the network, and it got made. The network, what would happen with the premises is after Arthur reviewed them and selected the ones out that he felt were the best, he would forward them on to the network, and they would have to approve them. And they wouldn't always approve them. It wasn't a rubber stamp by any stretch of the imagination. In that era, where there were only 3 networks and basically only 3 outlets for all of animation. And the networks were insanely powerful then and extremely hands-on, and I'll even use the word intrusive, into our process, into the studio's process. So the fact that Arthur would send over a premise, maybe only half of them would get approved, or maybe a third of them would get approved. It's just anyway, one of my first ones, one of the ones I remember, the bad guy in Zorro was called, I think, Lieutenant Ramon or Captain Ramon, and he was kind of the evil Spanish. He ran the Spanish militia that was controlling this territory of old California, and he was abusive and corrupt, and he was a classic villain. Let's just say he was a classic villain. So my idea was that he wanted to have a fort built in his honor with his name on it. It was going to be called Fort Ramon. And he was going to rob all the local ranchers and force them to pay for it. You know, you can think of it like Trump Tower, and only if Trump was using the taxpayer money to pay for it, which he probably did. Anyway, my idea was that Zorro was going to do everything he could to sabotage the building of this fort, and it was actually a very good idea for animation, I have to say. And Arthur liked it, and I think it was submitted to the network, and they liked it, and it was ultimately made. There was another one called The Takeover, but I don't remember the story of that one.
Now, was Fort Ramon the first one you wrote out?
I don't remember. I mean, there was a whole batch I would have to do when I would go in for those one-day gigs. You know, you'd have to turn in probably, I would imagine I would have to turn in at least 8 or 10 a day to maybe 8's high. Maybe 5 to 8 a day I would probably turn in as a good day's work. And I don't remember where Fort Ramon would lie in the batch. I'm not even sure if it was in the first day, although I think it was probably in the first day. But I mean, I turned in lots of them, and I think, any of them likely would have made good episodes. I mean, it's all so arbitrary which premises are chosen. It's just a matter of taste, really. And I mean, if you're a decent writer, and I was without knowing it, you know how to write a premise, and you know to write a premise. As you write the premise, you kind of know in your head how the script is going to go, and you know it's going to be a workable script, or you won't submit the premise if you can't envision the script. The whole point of the premise is to be able to present a very brief vision for what the full half-hour episode is going to be.
Did you have a process for coming up with the premises, or did you just spitball and then go from there?
Yeah, just spitball them, really, and you work by the way, one of the interesting things about animation, as opposed to a lot of live-action writing, is you very much worked as an individual in animation. You were in an office working by yourself. You really didn't collaborate in terms of the creative process. You might, once you got on staff and you started to know people and you became friends with the other writers, you might walk into somebody's office, and if you were stuck for a joke or something, or just wanted to bounce something off somebody, you would do that. But there weren't writers' rooms the way there are on sitcoms and some drama shows. There were no writers' rooms at all in animation. That never happened. So you're just in an office generating these things. And to answer your question, if I had a process, I don't remember what it was, but I do remember. I think maybe this is in a sense a process. I think I would often try to think of a title first, or at least the idea and the title should sort of come at the same time, because that would really help you focus the premise. And as I said earlier, having a catchy title, I think, was really helpful in terms of sort of the next person up the chain reading it and getting it and remembering it and having it stand out from 20 other premises or 50 other premises that they read that day. You know, the goal is to have yours stand out and feel unique and feel special. And I always think having a good title would help that.
Could you talk about Arthur Nadel? What was he like?
Oh, my goodness. Yes, I certainly could talk about him. You know, Arthur had some really fun live action credits. His background was in live action, and he'd worked on things that I'd watched as a kid and loved. I found out much after becoming his friend that he was the film editor on Sky King, which I used to watch as a kid, and he worked on The Rifleman. I think he was the producer on The Rifleman with Chuck Connors, which I used to watch, and I think the Virginian, which was I think a big deal 90-minute Western that was on as I was a kid, and he was also really proud of I think his proudest moment, Arthur, was he directed the Elvis Presley feature film Clambake, and he got to work with Elvis. So even though I was working with him in an animation context, he had a really colorful background and was just a great guy. He was extremely dignified, kind of an older man. I think he was maybe in his 50s when I met him. He was like a schoolmaster, you know, very stern, but at the same time, really nice, really fair, really honorable, really decent, and a great sense of humor. If it wasn't for his sense of humor, he might not have been likable, but his sense of humor was wonderful, and his kindness was wonderful, his heart. He was very strict. You know, he was really strict about the hours. You know, you had to be in your office at 8:30. You couldn't leave before 5:30. And, you know, he would kind of walk up and down. There's an old joke about, I think it was Louis Mayer walking up and down the writers' rooms listening for the typewriters, you know, making sure typewriters were all clacking. We were on typewriters, by the way, when I first started, believe it or not. There was a Selectric in every writer's room, an IBM Selectric. Boy, I'm really dating myself. We went to computer while I was there. But anyway, there's the old joke about Louis B. Mayer listening for the typewriter clacking. And Arthur was a little bit like that. I mean, he wasn't that onerous, and he was very well liked. Everybody liked him. But there was sort of a sense of, he had a very strong work ethic. And when freelancers would come in, there was a group of staff writers always at Filmation, maybe anywhere from 2 to 7 staff writers would work there, depending on how busy we were. And but then we would always, when we got busy and a series got picked up, we would use a lot of freelancers, and the freelancers would all come in to have their meetings with Arthur. And you know, a lot of us knew each other, and we became friendly. And one of Arthur's pet peeves always was when the freelancers would stop to schmooze with us on their way in or out of his office. Arthur didn't want the freelancers, you know, taking us away from our work and schmoozing with us. But it was all in good fun, and I don't in any way, shape, or form want to suggest anything negative about Arthur, because I absolutely love the man, and he was very beloved by all of us who knew him. But he had his quirks, and his famous thing on the script he would write, you know, a note would be DB, letter D as in dog, B as in boy, DB, which always stood for do better, and you'd always, whenever you'd see the dreaded DB on script, it was never a good thing. I'll tell you another funny story, and again, stop me if this is not the stuff that you want. But
go for it.
From the very first day when I was turning in the premises to Arthur, the very first day I worked there, and he called me into the office at the end of the day, and he had my premises, I noticed that he had given me an A on all my premises letters, an A with a circle. And later on, as I continued to work there, every time I turned something in, he would call me into his office after reading, I'd see the little A with the circle, and I thought, gee, I'm doing pretty well. I'm getting nothing but A's from this guy. And then one day he called me in, and I saw my script there and had the A on the circle, and I was waiting for my praise and my minimal notes, you know, when you got an A. And he said, Robby, the script had really a lot of problems. This is one of the poorest things you've ever done. And I said, Arthur, I don't understand. You gave it an A. And he said, A? I said, yeah, look right there. It's a circle A. He said to me, that's for Arthur. That just means I read it. So all the times I thought I was getting A's, I wasn't getting A's. It just meant that he'd read my script or my premise.
What made him such a great guy to work with?
You know, the combination of ethics and sense of humor. I mean, he was just had a real moral center and a really good heart. And he could be strict, but never in a mean or intimidating way, in a motivating way. And he was just funnier than hell. He had a great, great sense of humor, and he was super fun to hang out with. I mean, I would go to lunch with him a lot, and I became friends with him, and he was a great friend. Lou Scheimer loved that man. So it was a love affair. I mean, mutual love affair. They both really loved each other, but Lou just thought the world of Arthur, and they were kind of two peas in a pod. They were just two so atypical people that you find in the entertainment industry. Most people in the entertainment industry are crass, and I won't say most, but many crass and self-serving, and it's not a business known for its moral compass. And Arthur and Lou were just both exceptional in that way, and I was so fortunate to stumble into their employ and then later their friendship in both cases. Anyway, he was a great guy. We became super close. He was my mentor. He was very, very much my mentor. We'd go to lunch a lot. He had a son. He had 2 kids, but I think he felt very fatherly towards me. And I remember he had a stroke, a very mild stroke, and he had to go to the hospital while I was working there, and he wouldn't let anybody see him. Nobody was allowed to visit him. He didn't want any visitors except me. He wanted me to come. And I was really and he was fine, by the way. He didn't have any symptoms. There was no slurred speech. It wasn't, I don't know. He was a very, very private guy and very dignified guy. And I guess he just didn't like the idea of anybody seeing him in the hospital. But I was really, really touched that he wanted to see me. And I was very, very close to him. And Lou Scheimer was the head of the studio. He was Arthur's boss. And I became very friendly with Lou as well later. And Lou eventually asked me to start a new unit at Filmation to work in parallel with Arthur, a unit specifically devoted first to development and then devoted to the feature films that we were working on. And I always felt great ambivalence because I felt on some level that I was betraying Arthur, and I think he felt that way too, although I certainly had known I would never want to do anything that would have hurt him or threatened his job. And I knew that Lou absolutely adored Arthur. He adored him and respected him and would never have fired him or anything. I mean, Arthur was totally secure with Lou, and I knew that. So that was part of why I sort of agreed to lose Arthur, because I knew it really wasn't going to be a threat to Arthur. But I think Arthur couldn't help but perceive it on some level as a threat. And I always felt very, very badly about that. But we were friends. Arthur and I were close until he died suddenly and prematurely. Right after I went to Deke, I think it was when we were doing Captain Planet. Whatever year we were doing Captain Planet, maybe 89. 1990. Well, we're probably starting to produce it in 89. So I think that's when Arthur died. It was maybe 88 or 89. It was really sad. I was really, really sorry to lose him. And as I say, we stayed friends. In fact, we were scheduled to have dinner together 2 nights after he died. I was on the schedule to have dinner with him.
Could you talk about Lou Scheimer?
Oh my goodness, yes. Lou, as many great things I have to say about Arthur, Lou, I would say tops them. I mean, Lou is one of the most. I think Lou is the most amazing person I've ever known. I really do, on so many levels. I mean, to start with, he was incredibly, incredibly charming and incredibly kind and cared about people and remembered everybody's name, remembered their wives' names, and, always had time for everybody. And just, many people talk about their workplaces as a family. And Filmation was one of the few places I've ever worked that truly, truly felt like a family. And it all emanated from the top, which was Lou. He just was such an incredible guy and incredible sense of humor. Oh my God, that guy was funny. And a great raconteur. I mean, there is nobody you would rather sit next to at a dinner than Lou Scheimer. I mean, he was just the world's greatest storyteller and had so many of them. He was honorable. He was incredibly talented, incredibly intelligent. And I became really, really close friends with Lou, probably even closer after I left Filmation. But during my latter years there, I worked directly for him. After I stopped working for Arthur, and I was reporting directly to Lou, and I felt so close to him, and it made it such a pleasure to work there because of him. Again, we stayed super, super close until he died. He lived a long life, but he had dementia Parkinson's, which is a terrible, terrible way to go, and a slow deterioration. And it was just horrible to see this incredibly vibrant, vital, brilliant man sort of mentally deteriorate before my eyes. It was awful.
Well, in regards to Lou Scheimer and his legacy, could you talk about the quality of animation that came out of Filmation and what made Filmation so unique at that time?
Yes. Well, first of all, the one thing I neglected to mention about Lou is he was also an artist by background. He started off as an artist, and he was quite a good artist. That was not always true of executives and entrepreneurs. Lou had an incredible combination of artistic sense, creative sense, and business sense. I mean, just amazing combination of skills. It's so rare to see that high a level of all three. Filmation used a system called limited animation, which basically there's a great phrase in animation called pencil mileage, which basically means how many lines have to be drawn in an episode. And limited animation was sort of pioneered by Hanna-Barbera, which was a way of just not moving a lot on the screen at one time. Sometimes just moving mouths, just moving eyes. It was dictated by budget and schedule. And everybody always talks about budget and cheapness, but also schedules were a huge challenge in animation, because the networks would make their orders at the beginning of the year and want their shows on in the fall. And to work that quickly and within the budgets that were allowed, you had to make all these compromises. One of the compromises that I believe Filmation pioneered and was a source of frustration to a lot of the artists that worked there was what was called a stock system, where they would animate certain things like a walk cycle, or He-Man slashing his sword in a certain way, or Fat Albert laughing in a certain way, or just certain actions they would animate, and they'd animate them really well, and they'd look great, but they would oblige the artist to use those pieces of footage in every episode. There was the stock run, the stock this, the stock that. In fact, they issued what were called stock books to the storyboard artists. They did not issue them to the writers, which I think was a really smart move. So the writers didn't technically have to concern themselves with this, although as a staff writer there and one that stayed there for a long time, I really made an effort to educate myself about everything that went on in the building. And, it was a great thrill and pleasure for me as a curious person to be able to follow my script from department to department, literally, because the other thing I should mention about Filmation, it was the last TV animation studio in existence that was doing all of their work in the building. Everybody else had started outsourcing some or all of the animation processes overseas, where the labor was so much less expensive and it could be done so much more cost efficiently. But Lou, as an artist himself and as a staunch union supporter himself, in fact, sideline, there's a great story that Lou once joined a union picket line picketing his own studio, which is a great story. I mean, he was the owner of the studio, and the union was on strike, and he joined the picket line in front of his own studio. Anyway, he was committed at expense and sacrifice and so much difficulty, committed to keeping all of the work in the U.S. and in his studio. And it was amazing that he did so for so long, and really something that everybody admired that worked there and was appreciative of. Anyway, so there were all the different departments right there in the building. You could follow your script from department to department. So I learned about the stock books, and I learned a little bit about all the aspects of animation, which really served to inform me better as an animation writer. And it was a luxury I had that the freelance writers didn't have, and that some of the other staff writers, frankly, didn't take advantage of because they didn't care, but I did. So anyway, they used the stock system. That was one of their innovations. But ultimately, I think the animation was quite limited because of time and money, and because the stock system in itself was a limitation, because you'd see certain scenes that look great, but if you watched the shows regularly and you were paying attention, and I don't think most kids were, but anybody that was sort of studying the shows would recognize these pieces of animation that were being used over and over in every episode. One of the great thrills of working on the 2 feature films at Filmation was they did not use the stock system, and they had both an increased budget and especially an increased schedule. They had more time, so the animation on those features was a complete different level of quality above what we were doing for TV, and it was a thrill to be able to work on something at a higher level like that. It was just such a luxury, a wonderful luxury, not just for me, but for all the artists that worked on it. There was a completely separate unit made for the feature films in a completely different location, different building, and everything was sort of different about those feature films.
I have a list of a couple of shows that you are credited with writing for at Filmation.
Okay.
Any thought you may have? First and foremost, Blackstar.
Blackstar. Yes, that was when I was first hired, the first day, and I was assigned to do Zorro premises. I think the studio had something like 5 series picked up for that fall. It must have been in the spring that this happened of 1980. Just logically thinking of when it would have occurred, because the networks make their order in the early spring, and that's when the studios get to work on the production. So it must have been in the spring, and Zorro was just one of 5 different series that had been ordered for the fall, and Blackstar was a different series. And there was a writer already there by the name of Tom Ruegger, who went on to great success at Warner Brothers on Animaniacs and Batman and other things, I guess. But those were his 2 claims to fame. And he was young. He was about my age, maybe a little younger. And I didn't know how long he'd been there, when I first came, but he was already hired on staff, and Blackstar was his baby. I mean, he had developed it, and he was doing premises for it, and I guess they probably already started the scripting process, because I think it had been ordered. So anyway, I sort of knew Blackstar as being Tom's project. I knew of it, but I was working on something else. And then later, after Arthur hired me, and after I'd done a couple of Zorro scripts. No, that wouldn't be right. I'm wrong about that. After I was hired, my very first script that I did at Filmation was a Blackstar script, and I think it was an already approved premise. I know it was. It was an already approved premise, and it may have already been an already approved outline, and it may even have been an existing script, like a first draft that somebody had done. I don't remember, but there was a big chunk of work had already been done on it. And Arthur, did not yet trust me to write screenplays. I had successfully done premises, and he knew I was great at generating premises, but I had not proved my mettle to him as a screenplay writer yet, even though I had written screenplays. I'd ghostwritten the screenplays for Hanna-Barbera. I don't know if Arthur realized that I could do it. I mean, I think he thought it was a new thing to me. So I remember this Blackstar script was sort of a tryout for me, and it wasn't a complete page 1 script. There was already material there for me to work with. But it was called The Quest, and I don't remember anything else about it other than the title. And it was the very first script I did at Filmation. And Arthur was very happy with it. And from that point on, I was approved to write scripts.
The Super Globetrotters?
Well, that was Hanna-Barbera.
Oh, okay.
That was one of the ones I ghost wrote. And
okay.
Maybe that must have been the one, I was amazed that you had that on your list. That must have been the one. I mentioned that, after I ghost wrote a couple of scripts, I finally, the third time I demanded a shared credit instead of just ghostwriting. So that must have been one of the ones that I demanded shared credit for, because I wrote that for Hanna-Barbera under the auspices of the person that I had been ghostwriting for.
Are you at liberty to give the name of that writer?
I'd rather not.
Okay.
I'm at liberty to, but I think I won't.
Okay, that's fine. Can you talk about Hero High?
Yes. I think that was another one that was amongst the ones that had been ordered for that fall when I first started. I think I've got my chronology correct, although it might have been the next year. I kind of all blends together. But I think that was the first year, too. That was an interesting concept. I think it was an hour, if I'm not mistaken, on NBC, and it was going to have live-action wraparounds and consist of components. One of the components would be a new original series called Hero High, which was a high school for superheroes, which is a premise that I've seen used many times in series since then. I don't know if it was ever done before then, but it was a good idea, I thought. It had been created before I got there. Once you're on staff at Filmation, you just kind of typically just jump from show to show and go where you're needed. And so at some point they needed premises and scripts for Hero High. So I generated several premises for Hero High that were approved and used. In fact, more than I had time to write myself. So a couple were given away. And one of the premises, just for as a by the by, one of the premises was called the Big Bang Theory. That was actually the name of a premise that I did for Hero High back at Filmation. Of course, went on to be the same title as one of the most successful shows in television history. But titles are not protectable or copyrightable, and I wouldn't have owned it anyway. Everything you do at the studios like Filmation, everything is work for hire. The studio owned it. But anyway, I did a premise called The Big Bang Theory. It was one of the ones I did for Filmation, and there was one that I did a whole. They were short episodes. They were only 10-minute episodes, I think, or 7-minute episodes. They were shorts, and so I was able to generate one whole episode just from a stupid joke that I thought of. I had this idea of a stupid joke of two prisoners in a cell, and one smart prisoner and one dumb prisoner. And the smart prisoner saying, "Hey, I'm going to break out tonight," or the line is, "I'm breaking out tonight." And the second prisoner brings out like skin cream, like acne medication. Says, "Here, why don't you try some of this?" I thought that was a funny joke, and so I used that to generate a whole premise about these guys trying to escape prison, and the heroes having to stop them. And it was a fun premise. I ended up trying to sort of parody the old black and white prison escape movies with the searchlights and all that. I mean, it was a fun sort of genre parody, which is always a fun thing to do in animation. So I remember that episode of Hero High that I wrote. I wrote a couple others too, but I don't remember them. I also wrote the other component of the Hero High Hour was a series called Shazam, which was not the same Shazam as in the recent Marvel superhero movies. This was a guy Shazam, and when he would say the word, I think his Clark Kent identity was Billy Batson, I believe was the name, and he would say the word Shazam, and he would turn into this superhero. And I think I may have written one of those as well. I'm pretty sure I did. And the other thing I remember doing quite a bit on that series is adjusting lengths. I became sort of the length expert. When a script would go to the storyboard department and it would be recorded, they would then time it out. And if it was too long, or especially if it was too short, they'd have to figure out some really clever, simple way to elongate it without having to do all sorts of new animation and without having to record any new dialogue. And I seemed to have a knack for that, so I got handed a lot of those, especially on Shazam. I remember doing quite a bit of having to come up with ways to pad the length to fill it to meet the network length.
Do you have an example of a way that you...
I had one example where somehow the characters ended up in an exhibit of a museum of superhero events, and there was a series of they were in a gallery of still shots, and there was I came up with the idea of doing a series of these still shots of famous superhero moments, and they were funny little things that could be captured in a still drawing. No animation at all was required. You just put the camera on the still for 5 or 7 seconds, long enough to see what was going on, and then I think you had to have dialogue for this. Maybe we had to do a voiceover, and the character would say, "And then look at this one." And there was a series of these stills, and I think it filled in about a minute, which was, or maybe 40 seconds, but that was a long time to have to fill in a 7-minute piece or a 5-minute piece or whatever it was. That's just one that I remember. But there were lots of things like that where you try to come up with anything that won't just feel like filler, but it'll feel entertaining. It'll feel like it's either adding to the story or be entertaining in its own right. And I think that's the challenge of writing filler, not just plain filler that feels like filler. That's what you want to avoid, is having it feel like filler. And then in terms of cutting, that really becomes a logic challenge, because you have to just be on top of what the audience needs to know for the story to track, and make sure that nothing you cut prevents the logic of the story from making sense from beginning to end. So that's the challenge in cutting, is you can't take away anything that hurts the story. And that can actually be harder than adding, because if it's well written in the first place, if a script is well written in the first place, it won't have extraneous material. In theory, everything in a script should be furthering the story along. And so if you take a well-written script and it ends up being too long, it can be a challenge to cut it without destroying the logic of the story.
Gilligan's Planet?
Oh my goodness, that was really a fun one because, of course, it was based on the famous Gilligan's Island series, which I and everybody else had watched as a kid. And that was my first encounter with celebrities in this job. I had a lot of encounters with celebrities at my radio job when I worked on the talk radio show. We had lots of celebrities come through there, so I was used to dealing with celebrities. But this was my first time at Filmation, and this was the first time celebrities were actually reading my lines, which was, to me, really a thrill. These actors that I'd watched as a kid. You know, we had all the original cast doing voices for Gilligan's Planet. You know, the premise of Gilligan's Planet was basically that the professor, when they're stranded on the island, the professor concocts a rocket ship that's going to fly them all to the mainland and to freedom, and finally they're going to come off the island. Only, of course, Gilligan screws up, and the rocket ship overshoots America, it overshoots the continent, it overshoots the Earth, and it ends up crashing into an asteroid, and they're stranded on an asteroid. So now instead of being stranded on an island, they're stranded on an asteroid in space. That was not my idea, by the way. I must have been. I'm guessing that was probably Lou Scheimer's idea, but it was. I did not come up with that premise for the series, but I thought it was a great premise, and we worked with Sherwood Schwartz, who was the original creator of Gilligan's Island and kind of a well-known television personality, and quite a genius in his own right, and it was really fun to be able to work with him. And I remember he was very complimentary of the writers at Filmation. There were about 3 of us on staff that were working on that. And Sherwood Schwartz really was very impressed with us. He told Arthur. Arthur passed along that he had been very complimentary to us, which was really a great compliment. Anyway, we had all the original cast did voices except for Tina Louise refused to have anything to do with it. And apparently she always refused to have anything to do with any of the live action reunions or anything. She wanted nothing to, apparently once she was through with the series, she wanted nothing to do with it ever again. But all the other original actors came in to do voices, including Jim Backus. Dawn Wells, I think, did Marianne, is that the right act? Yeah. She did. She actually did the voice of Ginger as well. She did both of the female voices on our series. Anyway, I'll never forget, this is a funny story. I had an office with a window, and I remember the first day that the cast from Gilligan's Island was coming in to record, and they had the parking lot was such that they had to walk right past my window, each cast member, and it was great. You know, first I see Bob Denver go by, and then I see the professor go by, and then Dawn Wells go by. The last one to come was Alan Hale, Skipper, and I swear he was wearing the white Skipper cap. I couldn't believe it. But the funny part of the story for me was he's walking by, and there's like a little kind of a tree planter in front of my office, and he's wearing white shoes. And he walks by, and suddenly he looks down at his shoe, and he makes this disgusted look, and he starts scraping his shoe. He steps in dog shit on the way into the recording studio. And it was just, and I had to, like, it was a two-way window. Like, my window was a mirror on the outside, so he couldn't tell that I was right there watching all this. And I thought to myself, this guy's going into the studio with dog shit on his shoe. And it was, you could envision, he's wearing a stupid hat, and you could envision him just screaming, Gilligan! It was so in character. It was so entertaining to me to see this. Anyway, I was not going to recording sessions, and I was merely a writer, and writers normally did not go to recording sessions. In animation, typically writers don't go. And I didn't go to recording sessions till we started working on the feature films, and I got to go to all those, and it was great. Anyway, but just knowing that those people were recording my scripts was fantastic, and they were super fun scripts to write because you knew the characters so well. I mean, I'd grown up with them, and they're such fun characters to write for, and they're so well drawn out. It was just, those scripts sort of wrote themselves in a way. The fastest script I've ever written was one of the ones I wrote for Gilligan's Planet. Usually you were given, maybe a week or so to write a script, a half-an-hour script, and that's after you had an approved premise, just for the script itself. I remember there was one Gilligan script that was just, I don't know, it just was on fire one day, and I wrote literally 2/3 of the script after lunch one day. I think those scripts were about 35 pages long, and I think I wrote 20 pages after lunch in one afternoon, which was really, really fast. And they were good. I mean, I didn't have to, it wasn't a case of just blurting out a bunch of stuff that you later had to fix. It was, they all stuck in the show, pretty much.
I know this is after He-Man, but because we're going to spend a little bit of time on He-Man, Fat Albert and the Cosby Kids.
Oh, yes. Well, Filmation had done the original series for the network prior to my arrival at Filmation. But since Lou had opened this new distribution avenue with selling shows directly into syndication, which meant selling them to local stations market by market rather than selling them just once to the network. You'd find a distributor and you'd go sell them in each market. And it created a huge new opportunity and market for animation where they could be on 5 days a week rather than just 1 day a week on Saturday morning. And so his idea was to do the same thing with Fat Albert and make a bunch of new Fat Alberts and distribute them in that manner. And apparently there was a market for it, an appetite for it. So we did it, and I got to work on it. In fact, I think there was only a couple of staff writers working on it at the time because it was. I think we started it in between. I think we actually wrote it. I'm almost sure that we wrote it before He-Man. I think it came on after He-Man, but I'm 95% sure that we wrote the scripts prior to He-Man. And I might be wrong about that, but I don't think so. I'm almost sure I'm not wrong about that. And it was a kind of a quiet time in Filmation. And one of the challenges in the animation industry is, after a network season was over, until you got your next order, there was no work. And a lot of people would get laid off, and especially writers. And they would only keep on the writers they liked best. And so I was really honored and fortunate to always be kept on at Filmation. I never experienced a layoff in my entire time there, which was really remarkable, especially for a writer, really unusual. And so Fat Albert, I remember sort of going on during one of those quiet times, and there weren't many writers working on it. It was a pro-social show. Every show was sort of based on a lesson or a piece of education or something of value to kids. And I had a particular affinity for this because I had ended up as a psych major in college. And in fact, I almost went to graduate school in psychology. So I was very interested in those kinds of themes and child development and all that. That was an area of great interest to me. And we worked with a professor at UCLA named Gordon Berry, who was an educational and developmental, I guess he wasn't in the psychology department. I guess an educational developmental psychology expert. And I got to know him quite well, and I had a great relationship with him because, he was like a professor that I'd had in school, and I always got along great with my professors. So, and a lot of writers would really resent what they felt was an intrusion into the creative process by these consultants. But I didn't feel that way. I felt it was a great asset, and I really enjoyed their input, and I enjoyed the challenge of trying to respond to their input. And of course, Bill Cosby had to review every script. And he would come in and do live-action wraparounds. They would shoot these live-action wraparounds where he would sort of narrate the cartoon that was going on. So I got to experience a little bit of Bill Cosby, which was quite unpleasant. He was a very, very, very unpleasant guy, and this was long before any of his sex scandals or anybody knew.
Came to light.
Yeah, and nobody knew that, but he did not have a popular rep. He was not popular amongst anybody that worked with him. I mean, he was a miserable guy. He was a miserable guy, in my opinion. And I saw him behave very badly, and it was kind of the dark side of showbiz for me. And I mean, he's not the only one, obviously, but I mean, he was one of the people that kind of represents to me the sort of the dark side of the industry, and these people that behave horribly and get away with it and are rewarded for it, frankly. Anyway, the other thing about Fat Albert that was sort of interesting is Fat Albert, part of the formula for Fat Albert is there was always a show within a show. In other words, the characters in Fat Albert would always, in the middle of the episode, they would run to watch their favorite series, which was a sort of superhero spoof called The Brown Hornet. It was sort of a black superhero, and it was great. It was really fun, but it was like a whole separate episode within the Fat Albert episode, but it always related to the lesson of the Fat Albert episode. That was the challenge of it. And so Lou Scheimer, for these new batch of episodes, I think it was Lou, it might have been Arthur, wanted to come up with an alternative to the Brown Hornet, alternative show within the show. And so this was an idea I came up with that was called Fair Bear. And it was sort of like kind of like a Smokey the Bear type of character that was a sheriff in the forest. And he had a young deputy that was like a squirrel whose name I don't remember or something. And there would be funny adventures in the sort of setting of a forest that would try to illustrate that Fat Albert episode that it was within. So a few of the Fat Albert episodes from that era, instead of the Brown Hornet, they had Fair Bear as the show within the show, and I'll claim credit for that. That was kind of my baby. I have to say it didn't work out great, and I don't think we used them in a lot of the Fat Alberts, but there were a few of them.
You wrote an episode of Fat Albert that dealt with sexually transmitted diseases. Am I correct in that?
Yes. Thank you for reminding me about
that. In a serious way.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of my points of pride that I managed to find a way to deal with sex for 12-year-olds or under, and that was approved by not only our educational consultant, but, well, I was going to say it was approved by Network Standards and Practices, but I'm just remembering now, it wasn't a network show, it was for syndication, so there was no Network Standards and Practices. It probably wouldn't have been approved by Network Standards and Practices. But yeah, I thought that was an interesting topic, and I thought it would be a fun topic to write about. And I mean, that was always a criterion that I had when I was trying to come up with premises is, what would I enjoy writing about and what could I do a good job on? I mean, you wanted to do something good and something appropriate, but you also wanted to enjoy your job. So that was always figured into my thinking, and I thought, gee, this will be a fun one. And so I came up with this idea, and basically it had to be, obviously, it couldn't really deal with sex, of course not. So I just dealt with very, very, the most innocent, broad-based terms. And basically, there was a character in the series that met a girl, and I mean, they were young, they were kids, and they had their first kiss. I was able to do the first kiss. That was all I was able to do. And then later, I think I was able to make reference to, this generic sore that this kid had developed on his body, and that he better see a doctor or something. I mean, I'm not really doing it justice in summarizing it. I was a little more subtle and nuanced in the way I handled it. But basically, that was the concept, was if you have contact with the opposite sex, and, back then you wouldn't even consider dealing with gay. That was not sort of on the table then. But if you had contact with the opposite sex and you developed a medical symptom, you should see a doctor. That was the lesson to be learned. But I've always been sort of proud and amused that I was able to pull it off. I think I mentioned it was called Kiss and Tell. The other thing I did that I thought was sort of gutsy, and I was able to pull off, and and by the way, I give Lou Scheimer and Arthur both, but especially Lou, because the buck stopped with him. I give them huge kudos and credit for being willing to do some of these things, because they were risky, and there's no question that you could get a lot of blowback from conservative audience members. I mean, television was this broad-based medium, and it just hit people at every end of the spectrum. And you were always prone to get letters. You were always going to offend somebody on TV. And these kinds of shows in particular were sort of asking for trouble. And I really admire and appreciate Lou's and Arthur's courage to put some of the stuff out there that they knew would offend some people. Although I don't think it offended most, and I don't think it offended many. But the other thing that I think was courageous was I did a Fat Albert about deceptive advertising and about the dangers of commercials. And this was in a medium that was supported by commercials, and it was basically biting the hand that fed us. The name of the episode was called It All Adds Up. Again, real credit and kudos to Arthur and Lou for being willing to offend advertisers by putting this episode on the air and allowing it. They didn't have to do that. I mean, there were plenty of other ideas they could have done, but they chose to accept this idea. And I think it was a real fun episode, and I was happy with the way it came out.
And now we get to the big one.
Okay.
When did you first become aware of this property called He-Man and the Masters of the Universe?
Well, I don't remember the year, but I'm thinking, just from what I know retrospectively, it must have been 82. And it was during one of these quiet periods when we'd finished all of our network shows. And I think maybe we'd finished the Fat Albert, and there was kind of nothing for writers to do. I mean, there'd be these periods where really all we could do was sit in our offices and try and come up with new ideas for series, which were never going to go anywhere because there was just no market for original ideas back in those days. Everything had to be based on some existing property. I mean, literally everything in animation seemed to have to go that way. So even if writers were sitting in their offices coming up with good ideas, they would never see the light of day. But it was during one of these sort of fallow periods where there wasn't much to do. And I remember being called into a meeting with Lou and Arthur and a couple other writers on staff at the time. I think Tom Ruegger was still on staff, and maybe one other. Tom Ruegger went to Hanna-Barbera very shortly after that meeting, I remember. I mean, he left kind of before He-Man really got going. Anyway, this meeting was with Lou, and he was telling us about this new Mattel toy property, that we were going to get involved with, and it was called He-Man. And we all rolled our eyes because we thought, God, what a stupid name, He-Man. I mean, that name was a joke with us for a long time. That's the first I remember, and I think probably the next thing that happened was I think we had a meeting, again in Lou's conference room. I think the people from Mattel came to the meeting, and they had a bunch of prototypes for these toy characters and talked to us about their toy line and the figures they had developed for the toy line and the play sets and the vehicles. You know, boys' toy lines consisted of vehicles, play sets, and characters, articulating characters. And that's how they think of them. And by the way, toy companies always make a marked differentiation between what they consider to be a boy's toy and a girl's toy. They have completely separate divisions. At least they did back in those days. I'm sure it's still true. And so this was clearly a, quote, boy's toy. And, you know, as an aside, one of the challenges in developing toy properties for TV is always that gender distinction, because TV does not have a gender distinction. TV needs to be sort of a bi-gender appeal. It's got to appeal to both genders to be successful. If you just appeal to one gender, it's much harder to even get on TV, let alone to do well. So, you know, that's always the first challenge in these kinds of properties is if it's a boys' property, how to make it appeal to girls and vice versa, although mostly it went the other way. Mostly it was boys' properties that we had to try to make somewhat appealing to girls, which, you know, didn't always succeed. Anyway, so we had this meeting with the articulating characters. We were introduced to these characters, and the next thing I remember is there'd been a Bible written by a live-action writer. Mattel had gone to a live-action writer, a guy that had, I think, worked on a Lee Majors show at the time, which might have been The Fall Guy, or maybe there was another Lee Majors show. I can't remember. Do you remember The Fall Guy, what year that was?
81.
Okay, so that's what it was. It was The Fall Guy. So this guy, I think, had worked on The Fall Guy. His name was Michael Halpern, and he had created a Bible for a He-Man series. And there's a huge, huge difference between writing for live action and animation. I think that difference has blurred over the years, especially with CGI animation, which is a whole different ballgame, really. But back in the days of limited animation, there were certain things you could do to write for animation that just wouldn't work in live action, and especially vice versa, things you'd write in live action that just didn't translate well. And so typically, not always, but typically, even the very best live action writers were not necessarily good animation writers. And so this Bible just didn't really feel like an animation Bible. It didn't really feel like a series that could be executed. So the first thing I remember doing was rewriting a Bible for He-Man. And I know Tom Ruegger was involved in some way, too. And I sort of have lost a little bit of memory over sort of what Tom's contribution was and what mine was to that very initial Bible. But Tom left to go to Hanna Barbera right around then. And that left me, and I was kind of the main person working on He-Man at that point in time. And the next thing I remember was being asked to write a pilot script, which was the first script for He-Man. And I did, and it was called The Diamond Ray of Disappearance. I also remember there was a guy head of production at Filmation at the time named Hal Sutherland, who was one of Lou's original partners when Lou first founded Filmation in the 60s. Hal was one of his main partners and close friends. And Hal was there when I first started Filmation, working on Zorro. I think there was another guy there, but I didn't get along with at all, that was head of production. Nobody got along with. He was not a very nice guy. But I tried to get along with everybody, but this guy just wasn't likable. I think they brought Hal down to take over with Zorro because we were in a bind. We had so much work that first year when I was hired. There was so much work to get done, and I think Hal had moved to Washington State and had retired from animation. He was a painter, a wonderful painter. But Lou convinced him to come back to L.A. for the season and I think help work on Zorro and some of those shows. And I had an instant bond with Hal. I really got along with him well. I thought he was just a great guy and a talented guy. And he ended up working on one of the feature films. He was the director of one of the feature films that we did later. And I had a really good relationship with Hal going all the way through. And he wasn't at the studio for much of that time, but we just really clicked. And I remember during the development of He-Man, Hal coming down to me and saying, you know, and he was so right. He said, we don't have a comic relief character in this series. And I said, you know what? You're absolutely right. We need one. And so we talked a little bit about what would be a good idea. And I think it was Hal's idea to have a character that floated. It didn't have legs because that would, of course, help the animation. So much easier to animate. And I think it was Hal's idea also to have his mouth covered so we wouldn't have to bother with lip sync. I mean, Hal was always thinking practical production concerns, as he should. But my job was to make these characters fun and interesting and not worry about those things. But I tried to go with Hal's requests, we'll say, and I came up with this character that I originally called Gorpo, Gorpo, that later became Orko. And I came up with his personality and the fact that he was a magician and the fact that he was kind of a screw-up and this sort of childlike comic character, and that he was going to be sort of the audience surrogate because our audience was young. And so I wanted Orko. All the other characters in the series were adults, and so I wanted Orko to sort of be the child in the family, and a fun child at that. And so I'll claim credit for sort of Orko as well. There was no Orko in the Mattel line, and there was no Orko until Hal suggested a comic relief character, and I sort of came up with this character. Anyway, I wrote the pilot script called Diamond Ray of Disappearance, and my goal in the script was to introduce as many of the characters as possible, and to just basically, at Filmation, the way it worked is, especially, we knew we were going to be doing 65 episodes, and we knew we were going to have to do them in a very short time, and we knew we were going to have to hire a lot of freelance writers to work on these things. And so my goal in writing Diamond Ray of Disappearance, besides trying to write an entertaining script, was to set a template for the series, because I knew that my script was going to be handed out to every freelancer that came in and worked on the series thereafter. And this would sort of have to be the model for the tone and the way the characters talked and the way they worked together and how the locations worked and, pretty much all of it. As much as I could cram into a 35-page script and still tell a coherent story. The story is very weak in that episode. It's not much of a story, and the reason for that is because there were so many other tasks I was trying to achieve with it, and it worked out. It worked out well, that episode.
How long did it take to write the average He-Man script?
It depends on what you include when you talk about script. If you include the whole process, including the premise and the approval and, maybe the revised premise and all that, that might take, if you're working straight, solid straight through, that might be 2 weeks, maybe a week on the premise and all that stuff, and maybe a week on the script. And then if you had to rewrite the script, it'd be a few more days. So maybe a 3-week process altogether, something like that. I mean, the fact that I was on staff there, and I was kind of the main staff guy on He-Man the first season. I left He-Man after the first season, but the first season I was the main staff guy. And so I was juggling around between generating new premises, which sometimes were given out to other writers because I didn't have time to write scripts for all the premises I generated. So sometimes a premise I would generate, I wasn't able to write it simply because of the time factor, so they'd give it to another freelancer. And oftentimes I was handed scripts that came in from freelancers that needed to be rewritten, that didn't quite have the right tone, or sometimes had bigger problems than that. And I was being asked by storyboard guys to do the usual cutting and adding. So I was really kind of the jack of all trades that first season on He-Man, and kind of I don't mind saying that I was kind of the main guy on He-Man that first season. I worked on a lot of the scripts in different capacities.
What kind of notes did Mattel have, if any, in regards to the show or the characters?
Good question, and I don't remember a lot, but I know in general Arthur and especially Lou, and again to his great credit, they did their best to kind of insulate the writing process from notes from clients like Mattel or networks. I mean, we weren't completely insulated with it, and we certainly had contact with Mattel. But to a large degree, anything that was big would kind of get negotiated and mediated through Lou before it was filtered down to the writers. But, Mattel's main concern, and all toy companies' main concern, was that their characters were properly featured and that the names were mentioned. And, that could sometimes come into conflict with good storytelling, because especially the business with the mentioning of the names, because when people talk in dialogue, they don't frequently mention names all the time. I mean, they do occasionally, but mostly they don't. The names are assumed. So that was, one of the challenges was to try to keep the names alive without the dialogue sounding too clunky and too much like a commercial. We were accused of being commercials for the toys, and we really, as writers, and at Filmation in general, we tried very much not to be commercial for the toy. Our really job one and only job as far as the writers were concerned was to tell great stories. And Lou, based on his experience with Fat Albert, really was insistent, and Arthur too, both of them, were absolutely insistent that He-Man have positive pro-social values somewhat in the way that Fat Albert did, believe it or not. I mean, Fat Albert was set in an urban setting, and it was not a fantasy show. It was a reality-based show, and it was sole raison d'etre was to teach lessons and provide guidance for kids. That was its reason for being. He-Man, its reason for being was to it had three reasons for being. From our point of view, the writers, its reason for being was to entertain. That was our primary goal. From Mattel's point of view, its reason was to promote the property and help them sell their toys. But from Lou and Arthur's point of view, it was always to teach lessons. And there was He-Man started off this trend that took off in animation in succeeding years of having the main character come on the air at the end of the episode and talk directly to the camera and explain what the lesson was that was learned in that day's episode. And it was important that not just be a little tag at the end, but that actually that lesson was genuinely incorporated into the writing of the episode. And in fact, interestingly enough, Gordon Berry, who was the guy that we had used on Fat Albert, the consultant from UCLA, the educational consultant that we'd used on Fat Albert to help us target our lessons to kids in an age-appropriate way. That was Gordon's role, was to make sure that we were sort of teaching the right lessons in the right way for the age group we were trying to hit. He felt uncomfortable working on a series like He-Man because it was going to have action in it. And you'll note that I use the word action and not the word violence, because I think there's a big difference. And I think He-Man had action, and I think we didn't have violence. And I mean, I could elaborate on that, but let me continue on the track that I'm on. Gordon felt uncomfortable. He didn't feel he could comfortably contribute to He-Man, within the boundaries of his professional ethics, I suppose you would say. But Lou Scheimer's daughter was going to Stanford at the time, and she'd taken a communications class with a professor there named Don Roberts. And she suggested that Lou talk to Don to see about him working on our series. And he loved the idea, and he became our consultant on our educational consultant on He-Man. He was a professor at Stanford, extremely well-credentialed, well-respected, impeccable, unquestionable credentials. And Don turned out to be a sensational asset to He-Man, to other series afterwards. And when I went to Deke, I became friendly with Don. I really liked him. He's just a great guy, super fun, just a great guy to hang with, and brilliant, and I mean everything you could ask for, and a great storyteller. He had an incredible storytelling instinct. So his notes were, his mandate was to give us notes in terms of teaching the lessons and being age appropriate. But Don was able to do so in a way that would rarely hurt our stories and frequently help them, because he had such a good literary sense himself. He loved reading, and he was a big fan of literature, so that was a huge asset for us. And Don and I became good friends. I've stayed at his house, he stayed at my house over the years. So he was a big part of the He-Man formula, and he helped us to come up with these lessons that each episode taught, which He-Man or occasionally one of the other characters would recap at the end of the episode, speaking right into the camera. And I have to say, He-Man, of all the series that I worked on, has probably resonated the most. That's really my sense. And I've been to these. I went to one of these He-Man cons a couple of years ago, conventions like Comic-Con, only dedicated to He-Man, and I was absolutely flabbergasted at the number of people in their 40s that had been so profoundly impacted by He-Man as children, watching He-Man. And a big part of that, a huge part of that, was the lessons and the sort of morality that Lou and Arthur had insisted that we weave into this series. And, I only take credit for executing it. I do not take credit for insisting that we do that or conceiving that we do that. And, all these people at the convention were thanking me and crediting me and complimenting me. And I felt fraudulent because, I think I executed those requests well, but I was doing what my bosses told me to do. My bosses were, to their great credit, were insistent that we, A, incorporate these lessons into the series, and B, not put anything in the series that was irresponsible or might have a bad effect on kids. And I'll give you, this is an example that I always give, and it's such an unusual example, but I wrote a scene in the script once where He-Man crawls out on the branch of a tree to rescue an animal, and the tree branch breaks, and He-Man falls, and he ends up still saving the animal by grabbing onto another branch or something. But Arthur gave me a note in the script. He said, "We can't do this," he said, "because He-Man wouldn't break a tree branch." And I thought to myself at the time, this is ridiculous. Come on, But I still think it's kind of ridiculous, to be honest. I mean, if I was the boss, I would not have given that note. I would have let the branch break. But I give the example to show the extent to which Arthur and Lou were conscious of and conscientious about how our characters act in He-Man and how He-Man would always do the right thing. And I remember another script I did where I recently went over. I found a first draft of one of my favorite He-Man scripts I did. It was called Dawn of Dragoon, which was kind of a special Orko dedicated episode. It was about the sort of origin planet where Orko came from, and he goes back to his origin planet, and Orko was kind of the star of this show. It was an Orko episode, and at the end of the episode, in my first draft, He-Man banishes the bad guy to. I concocted this. I think it was called Hole to Nowhere or something. It was this bottomless hole that dropped forever into eternity, and once you fell into the hole, you would fall for eternity. You would never land and splat and get killed, which is, this is an example of sort of what I would say is action versus violence. It was just a fantasy concept of banishment forever, essentially. And I had He-Man. His character ended up trying to attack He-Man, fell into this hole to nowhere, and was banished to fall forever. And that's how I ended my script. And I later realized that the episode had ended with He-Man reaching in to save the bad guy from this banishment. Even though it was the bad guy, He-Man wasn't going to let him fall to his eternal demise. And I realized that must have been a note I'd gotten from Arthur or Lou saying, He-Man wouldn't let this character perish, because that's not who He-Man is. And when I read the final script, of course that was right. It was so much more powerful the way I presume I had been directed to change it. Maybe I changed it on my own. I don't remember, but I'm guessing that I was given the note to not let He-Man let this character do himself in. Basically, it's like a character falling off a building, a bad guy, and a good guy reaching out, to grab him from the side of the building. That would be the analogy, and something you could understand.
I'm looking at the list of episodes you wrote. I don't know if anyone has ever asked you this before or ever brought it up, but I can't help but notice that more than half of them start with the letter D in their title. Is there a reason for that?
No, I never even thought of it before. If there's a reason, it's deep in my unconscious, and I don't know what it is.
Okay. So you talked about working on He-Man. Was He-Man the last property you worked on before you went to the film division of Filmation?
Yes, it was.
Okay.
Yes, in fact, I remember specifically having to give up one of my premises that I really, really wanted to write. It was an approved premise called Heart of a Giant, and it was towards the end of the first season. I had really wanted to write that episode. I was looking forward to it because I'd caught up to everything else that I needed to do, and I was actually going to be free to write one more He-Man script. And I had my premise, and I was ready to go. And, as I mentioned earlier, when I write premises, I always see the whole script in my head. So once I've got the premise written, the script is sort of the fun part. And I remember being recruited by Lou to co-head this new department, and it was a wonderful opportunity. I mean, it was a great a show of confidence on Lou's part, an indication of confidence is what I was trying to say, of Lou in me to offer me. It was really an incredible offer that he made me. And, as I said, the first thing I wanted to make sure of was it wasn't going to impact Arthur in any way. And Lou assured me that it wouldn't. And I really would not have taken it had it in any way, I thought, had a material impact on Arthur's future at the studio. And it did not. I was told it didn't. Lou is a completely honorable person. When he says something, you can count on it. And it never did. But it was at the end of that He-Man season. And that's why I'm convinced that Fat Albert was written before He-Man, because I remember the last thing I did for Arthur was that first season of He-Man. That was the last time that Arthur was my boss, and I had to give up that last script. I remember a writer named David Weiss was given my premise because I had to move on. I mean, I wanted to move on, but it was bittersweet. It was very bittersweet to leave. I think I'd been with Arthur, I don't know, I guess 3 years. And, Arthur had given me my start in business and, frankly, in life. And I look upon my beginning at Filmation as really the beginning of my professional life, and as rescuing me from a decade of going nowhere. I think that the decade of my 20s, the 70s, I don't think I went anywhere, and I was going nowhere. And I think Arthur took me from the street and, made me respectable. So it was very, very bittersweet for me to accept this, but it was too good an offer to refuse. So, yep, I moved out of the writer's wing. I moved into a new office upstairs, started working with a guy named John Groost, who was on the art side. He was my counterpart on the art side, and we became super, super, super good friends and remain so. We started going skiing every Christmas together, and Erica Scheimer was the third cog in that wheel. There were three of us running that department. John, Erica, and me were sort of heads of that department. And Erica was a delight. She was fresh out of college. She was new, but, she'd grown up with Lou. She had done voices all her life. Lou had gotten her doing voices, and, she'd been exposed just by virtue of proximity for her whole life. So she had great instincts, and she didn't have this sort of young whippersnapper, I know best. And she was extremely respectful to both John and I and everybody. And so we had a great unit. We had a fantastic unit. We had a bunch of artists working for us, and I would usually have a writer working for us. And we were, sort of isolated in a certain part of the building. We had our own wing of the building. And it was just a wonderful, wonderful experience. I used to love going to work. And I have to say, I was freed from the obligation of constantly having to turn out scripts. I mean, I mentioned earlier it was fun, and it was fun, but there was a lot of pressure. When you're a staff writer, and every day of your life, your job is to go in at 8:30 in the morning and leave at 5:30 and to generate material day after day, hour after hour. That's your job. After 3 years, I never wanted to be a writer. I never started off in life craving being a writer, and I never felt that I was, writing was really my thing. I think I had a knack for it, but it really wasn't what I wanted to be doing with my time. And so I have to say it was a relief after 3 years to stop having to have that pressure to have to write every day. And also to be working directly. I'd become really friendly with Lou over those years. While I was working for Arthur, I'd become, friendly with Lou, and I liked him so much. He was just such a fun, personable guy to hang around. It was just being in Lou's presence was a thrill. I felt that till the day he died. Honestly, he had a charisma about him that just being with him made you feel great. There was a lot of just wonderful things to be said about my new gig, and it was more money.
So the two movies that you're credited as being the screenwriter on are Happily Ever After and Pinocchio and the Emperor of the Night. Now, Pinocchio was released first, if the information I've read is correct. Was that?
It was released and produced first. It was both. It was produced first and released first.
Okay.
And Lou had an idea. One of the things he had this idea about when we were in development, he had an idea called Filmation's Classic Collection. He had this idea. If you wanted to do a bunch of movies that were sequels to the public domain fairy tales that, for the most part, Disney had popularized, but not just Disney. I mean, for example, Lou had already done, I think, he did some Wizard of Oz animated film long before I was at Filmation. He did a feature film that was, I think it was a sequel to the Wizard of Oz, but I'm not sure it was a sequel. But I know it was some sort of an Oz project. And he tried to do some Oz projects, and we tried to do there was a novel written by L. Frank Baum that was also, he was the writer of Oz books. That was the story of Santa Claus, a really fun fictional legend about Santa Claus, but Lou had tried to produce as a feature. So it wasn't just the Disney fairy tales, but a lot of the fairy tales that Lou had in mind to write sequels to were Disney. One of the other ones was Dracula. He wanted to write a sequel to Dracula and Frankenstein. Basically, his only criterion was that they be great classic works of fiction, that they would appeal to kids, and that they were public domain. And I thought it was a great idea. And we developed this massive presentation of, I think, 10 of these, and wrote long stories of what each one was going to be, each sequel. And Lou tried to sell this as a package of 10, which would have been monstrous. And he never was able to sell it. But what that evolved to is he decided he wanted to just try producing them one at a time. And he was flush from He-Man. He-Man had been so hugely successful by then. I mean, it had been just a monster. It's hard to conceive in this day and age how big it was in its time and how much revenue it generated, especially from the toys, which I presume, I don't know this for a fact, but I presume Filmation and Lou, who was the owner of Filmation at the time, participated in some of the toy profits. So I think tons of money was made on And so Filmation was in a good financial position then, and I think Lou was of the mind to just do this and get and make a distribution deal to distribute the features directly through some sort of theatrical distributor. So we started off with Pinocchio, and it was run through our development department. And there was a writer Lou wanted to use that we knew from the TV side, named Dennis O'Flaherty, and he had written he had a feature film credit for, I don't know, one of the big ones like Wim Wenders or Jarmusch or one of these high-end directors that actually Dennis had actually, I think, written a script that was it wasn't a popular hit, but it was sort of a cult hit. So he had this great feature writing credit. He was a terrific writer, I might add. And he wrote the first draft for the Pinocchio sequel called Pinocchio the Emperor and the Night. And it came in, and it had a lot of good stuff in it, but it wasn't quite what Lou was looking for, to be honest. And it just didn't quite feel right, like an animated feature. So Lou asked me to completely take over the rewrite. And at that time, I had a writer that I had hired named Barry O'Brien, who went on to be a big primetime star in primetime writing, that is, the producer, writer, and was, oh my goodness, what a talented writer Barry was, and a very personable guy as well, great guy, but a true talent. And so I looked over the script, and I think with some input from Lou and Erica, we came up with kind of really a major rewrite to the script. And we kept some of Tennis's stuff, but we wrote really a lot of it. And I think the final credit is shared by Barry, Dennis, and me. I didn't really want the first position in the credit, frankly, because Dennis had generated the first draft, and the typical protocol with writing credits is typically the writer that writes the first draft gets the first billing when there's a rewrite and it becomes shared. But Lou absolutely insisted that I get the first credit. I mean, it was his decision. I couldn't alter it because he felt I had done the most to sort of reshape the script. It was made, and one of my thrills in that film was I was also a associate producer on the film. I mean, I was involved in everything about it, really, as was Erica, as was John Groost. Our team was basically quite involved with the film. Hal Sutherland was the director, and at one point we had a really fun cast of a lot of celebrities. So we had I thought a great celebrity voice cast. Tom DeLuise, who was a big star at the time, and Carol Channing and Sally Kellerman and Tracy Ullman. We had Ed Asner. We had some really fun people. But we wanted James Earl Jones, who had done the voice of Darth Vader, amongst others. We wanted him to be our villain, this evil, monstrous Emperor of the Night character that you don't really encounter till the end of the script. And James Earl Jones agreed to do it, but he was in New York, and he had to be recorded in New York. And I don't quite know why or how, but Lou asked me if I would like to go to New York to direct the James Earl Jones recording session. Because in animation, you don't always record the voices together. Sometimes you do, but mostly you don't. At least then, in the way we did it, we mostly recorded voices individually. And sometimes an ensemble, like Gilligan's Planet sessions were ensembles. But anyway, Lou said, do I want to go to New York? And I said, yes. And this was my first business trip in my life, where on an expense account, and I think I got to fly business class, and I was put up in the Parker Meridian in New York. I'd only been to New York once in my life, and it had been many years prior, maybe 15 years. I'd only been there one time. It was such a thrill, and I'll never forget this. We'd gone to computer by then, and I was working on one of the first portable computers was called the K-Pro 10, and it was gigantic. I'm trying to think of an analogy of how big it was. I mean, probably 2 by 3 feet, and it was heavy, and it had like 10 megs hard drive, which was considered gigantic at that time. I mean, it was such a Model T Ford. It was so far removed from how computers came. But I took my computer with me on the plane. It was just, I loved this huge thing. But it was, probably one of the early times when people were actually traveling with a computer, because this was really. The keyboard was a separate piece that was built into the computer. You had to unlatch it. It was really something. Anyway, I got to record James Earl Jones. It was my first time ever directing anybody was James Earl Jones. And, he was a little prickly. I mean, I didn't go quite as I would have liked. It was okay. He went okay. I mean, what we got was usable, and Lou was happy with it, which was mostly what I cared about. But it really wasn't. I wasn't really quite able to get from him what I had heard in my head. So it was a little bit creatively disappointing, but God, was it fun. What a thrill. It was one of the early thrills of my career. And of course, besides, I did so much travel for Filmation. I traveled all the time, and I loved it. And so this was my first taste of what I was going to get a ton of later in my career. Did I say Filmation? I meant Deke if I said Filmation.
How was that film received, Pinocchio, when it was released? Do you remember?
Not well. It didn't get great reviews. A lot of people resented that they felt we were trying to piggyback on the Disney Pinocchio. I mean, it couldn't possibly compare to the Disney. I mean, Disney Pinocchio is one of the classic animations of all time. And unfortunately, I mean, one of the flaws in Lou's concept, I think he didn't quite realize. None of us did. I don't think we realized the degree to which we were going to be compared to Disney as the standard. And by that degree, we were absolutely bound to fail. And so it did not perform well. I don't think it got good reviews. I mean, it wasn't a complete disaster, but it just didn't do well. And again, the reviews weren't, complete pan, but we didn't get very many good reviews. We got a couple good ones, but nonetheless, I got to go see it in a movie. We had a premiere, I think, Filmation. Plus, I just went to see it in a movie theater, and it was just, I think I was out of town. I think I may not be remembering this correctly, but I sort of think I was on a ski trip with John Grusd, who was my partner in the development unit. And I think we saw it when we were out of town. I think we were in Canada or something skiing, and we saw that it was playing in a theater, and we just went. And it was, I cannot tell you what a thrill it was to sit in a movie theater and see my name on the screen with a screenplay credit and see a movie that I had helped to make. It was a dream because, the one of the terrible downsides, really frustrating downsides of writing for television is you never, ever get to experience your work with an audience. You write in isolation, you produce with other people working on it, but then it just sort of goes out into the universe, and yeah, you can watch it on TV, but you can't watch it with strangers, and see how they're going to react. And people don't react to TV as much as movies anyway. Movies in the theater are just such a more visceral experience. So this was just a huge, huge highlight for me, was being able to go to a movie theater and see something that I had co-written and was an associate producer on. Wonderful, wonderful.
And Happily Ever After. Now, this would have come out later,
Right.
But I assume it would have
Correct.
was made before then. What is the story behind that film?
After Pinocchio, Lou wanted to do another one. I guess the financials, they weren't great, but I guess they weren't so bad that he couldn't try another one. And we all thought we learned a lot from Pinocchio, and I think we did learn a lot. So one of the other sequel ideas and again, this was Lou's idea. I give Lou complete credit for the idea. When we had done this package of sequels that we were trying to promote and sell as a package, one of them was going to be a sequel to Snow White. And Lou's idea was to do it with female dwarfs called dwarf elves. And so this film was originally titled, when I worked on it, Snow White and the Seven Dwarf Elves. And this time, Lou didn't go to a feature film writer, an external feature writer. He asked me to write it, which I was really flattered by. Vote of confidence. That was the phrase I was looking for. That was another great vote of confidence. Lou asked me to write the second film. But I didn't have enough confidence myself to write a full feature film by myself. I wanted a co-writer. So I told Lou I wanted to hire a co-writer. He said, that's fine. You can hire anybody you want. So I hired a woman that really had no credits that I knew socially, but I'd read a lot of her work, and she was extremely dedicated. I didn't know her that well, really. She was an acquaintance. But I was impressed with her, and I was really impressed with, she'd gone to film school. She directed. And I don't know, and she'd written one of the other sequels that I told you we wrote these long stories that we tried to sell. I think I'd given her one of those as a test to write, and she'd done a great job on it. So I took kind of a flyer with her. Her name was Martha Moran, and I hired her. And together we concocted the story for Snow White and the Seven Dwarf Elves. I think it was largely my story, although Martha certainly had some input to it. And we wrote it together, and we wrote it in a way, we outlined it together first, complete outline, and then we sort of alternated scenes. Like I'd be working on one scene while she'd be working on the next one. Then we'd trade pages and comment, and then we'd pick two more. I'd write one, she'd write the succeeding one, and we'd comment and trade. But eventually it sort of evolved that I was sort of more comfortable with certain characters and certain kinds of scenes, and she more comfortable with others. So we didn't always stick to that pattern of just simple alternation. But we basically wrote it together. she came into the office, and we worked there on the premises, and so we worked together every day. And we were happy with the script when it was done, and Lou was very happy with the script. And we had a different director, a guy named John Howley. We still had that unit, that separate unit to produce the features, and we got another fun voice cast. I just realized that when I named the voice cast for Pinocchio earlier, I was confusing some of the voices that we did for Snow White. So some of the names, I think a lot of the names I used were actually Snow White. But anyway, I mentioned Dom DeLuise. He played the Magic Mirror. Carol Channing, Phyllis Diller, who was this wonderful female comedian of the era, who is now dead. A few others. Oh, we used Malcolm McDowell for the villain, who was the bad guy in Clockwork Orange and many other things. He was sensational. Oh, my goodness. He was so terrific and such a pleasure to work with. Oh, that was a thrill. And I got to go to all the recording sessions on Snow White and Pinocchio, which was really fun for me. I love doing that. Recording sessions and animation are super fun things to be in. And, I got to meet all the stars, which was fun. Anyway, film was made. It was released. I guess there was a big delay in the release. I don't remember what the problem was. Here was the problem. I remember this now. Disney ended up suing us. And I don't remember if they sued us for Pinocchio, for Snow White, for both, or when exactly happened, but it turned out to be a major headache and litigation. And our argument was always that our films were based on a public domain property. In other words, Pinocchio, when Disney made Pinocchio, it was based on a public domain novel written, I don't know, in the 17 or 1800s by a guy named Carlos Collodi, I believe is the name. And Snow White, I think, was based on a Grimm's fairy tale or something like that. I don't know. But they were both clearly public domain properties. Disney did not own the underlying properties and could not claim copyright. But they could claim copyright to their interpretations of those properties, and they claimed that we were infringing on their interpretations and trading on their goodwill. And it became a huge, horrible litigation. And I think that's probably what tied up Snow White for so long, because it was a while before it got released, and it ultimately got released under a different name, Happily Ever After. But it did get released. I think it did a little better than Pinocchio and the Emperor of the Night, and it actually got some good reviews. And I'll never forget, Martha and I were thrilled that the script got a particularly special notice in the New York Times review, had praise for our script, and that was always a great point of pride to this day for Martha and I. Martha and I stayed friends, by the way. I used her a lot at Deke. She was just such a fabulous talent and so professional. She was a tremendous asset to me always. And so I gave her a lot of work at Deke, and we're friends to this day. But our special bond is our co-screenplay of Snow White and the Seven Dwarf Elves, a.k.a. Happily Ever After, and our special thrill was our review in the New York Times.
Had you left Filmation by the time the movie was released?
I believe so, but I can't remember for sure. I must have. I don't know. I shouldn't say that. I don't know.
It says you're credited with adapting Ghostbusters, not the real Ghostbusters, the original Ghostbusters.
Correct. We called it Filmation's Ghostbusters. That was the name.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, that's a kind of an interesting story. Filmation had done, before I came to Filmation had a live action unit, and they had done a couple of live action Saturday morning series. One was called Shazam, one was called ISIS, one was called Jason of Star Command. I had nothing to do with any of these. These were all before my time there. And Ghostbusters, a series called Ghostbusters, which, again, before my time, I had nothing to do with it. But it's kind of this funky series. Smash cut to my time at Filmation, my era, and I guess it was in 83, 84, Ivan Reitman and Columbia came out with their feature film called Ghostbusters. You might know what year it was. I don't remember for sure, but 84. I think it was around 84. Okay, good. And Lou felt that there was enough similarities between what they had done and his original series that was owned, the copyright was owned by Filmation, called Ghostbusters, from the 70s, I think it was probably telecast. So we went to Columbia and said, we think you've infringed on us. I think we did this before the film came out, because everybody knew about it, of course. And the irony, by the way, this is just a small coincidence, but several years before this, even before He-Man, during one of these slack times at Filmation when I was on staff and I wasn't working on a series, Lou met this guy named Michael Gross, who was an artist and extremely creative guy from the National Lampoon magazine. He was the guy that came up with the famous National Lampoon cover that showed a guy holding a gun to a puppy's head, and the cover said, "Buy this magazine or we shoot the puppy," which was famous. It was so funny. That was Michael's doing. He was just a visual, creative genius. And somehow he got hooked up with Lou Scheimer, and Lou wanted Michael to create something for Filmation. And I was assigned to work with Michael to come up with, the two of us, to come up with this property and develop it for Filmation. And we did. And it was, by the way, I think it was a terrific property. It never saw the light of day, of course. But I think we did a great job, and we worked together quite well. And I was friends. We stayed friends. Michael and I stayed friends for many, many years after that. And Michael went on to be hired by Ivan Reitman as basically his third in command, arguably his second in command. Ivan Reitman had sort of two lieutenants that were his main guys that did everything. And Michael was one of those guys. The other guy was a guy named Joe Medjuk. And so Michael was working on on Ivan Reitman's Ghostbusters, just coincidentally at the time, when we were taking legal action. And part of the settlement for this legal action was, I think there was a financial aspect to it. I don't know that. But part of it was that Filmation would have the rights to produce an animated version of their own Ghostbusters series, whereas Columbia and Ivan Reitman retained the rights to do an animated version of their movie, which was already in the works. I think their animated series, called The Real Ghostbusters, with a new company called Deke, I think was already in the works when this litigation or this all came to be. And the settlement in the settlement, basically, Columbia, Ivan Reitman, and Deke were allowed to do their series, but we were allowed to make a competing series that would just be called Filmation's Ghostbusters. And I was still at Filmation at the time, and I was asked as sort of part of the development unit, and I worked with Arthur on this because this was kind of an overlap between Arthur and it was going to be a series. It was going to be one of the next Filmation series, which Arthur was in charge of. Arthur was always in charge of the series at Filmation. That was the demarcation when I moved on to the development unit and what became the feature unit. That was my area. Arthur's area was TV. But there was an overlap on Ghostbusters because they asked me to write a multi-part episode that would sort of launch the series. And you do that frequently in animation because what you can do is you can take the episodes and then string them together and make a film out of it. And that was the idea, was to write sort of a multi-part launch to the series that would be 5 episodes of the series and also be able to be cut together as a film. And once again, I wanted help because there was also, not only was it a big chunk of work, but there was a time challenge as well. So I asked for a writer named Robby London, who had been on staff and I'd gotten to know through He-Man, and Fat Albert too. And was just a tremendous guy, wonderful, wonderful character, funny guy. Started off writing for Laugh-In, Ronan Martin's Laugh-In, before he became an animation writer, and just a gem of a human being, and so eccentric and quirky. Robby London, great guy. Anyway, I thought Robby would be the perfect writing partner to put this thing together. And so together, Robby and I came up with this sort of 5-part epic story, and we divided it into 5 scripts and split it up. And he wrote some of the scripts, and I wrote some of the scripts. And that's what kind of launched the Ghostbusters series. And I wrote a couple other Ghostbusters episodes along the way, too, because what would happen is when the development department was quiet, Lou fairly, and the company fairly, and I felt this way, too. I was being paid a good salary, and I didn't want them. They wanted to get value out of my salary. So if I wasn't doing anything else, I was kind of asked to go to Arthur and volunteer myself as an episodic writer to write scripts. And so I wrote a few Ghostbusters scripts that way, and Arthur became my boss again, temporarily when I did that, which was fine, no problem. And we did a show called Bravestar, a series called Bravestar. And I think I wrote at least one Bravestar under the same auspices because there was a quiet time in my development department, and they needed scripts for Bravestar. So I was asked to write one, and I wrote at least one of those, and I wrote a few Ghostbusters scripts during that era. Anyway, the fun, interesting part of the story, and I guess we can get to it later in the chronology, is I later went on, after working on Filmation's Ghostbusters, I later went on to work on the real Ghostbusters that Deke had been producing simultaneously, and I think I'm probably one of the few people to have worked on both of those series in a significant way. I mean, I had a credit as I think my credit on the real Ghostbusters was, I think it was coordinating producer or something. It was some sort of producer. That was my credit. I don't know what my credit was on Filmation's Ghostbusters, but I had a lot to do with it. I think I wrote the Bible, too. That's right, I wrote the Bible for it. I forgot. I wrote the Bible for Filmation's Ghostbusters. So I guess you could say I sort of developed. I wrote the Bible and I wrote the early scripts, so I was kind of the main developer on that series.
You have adaptation on original Ghostbusters and, where was it? Creative consultant on Reel.
Well, I think later on Reel, I may have started off as creative consultant, but I think I was on Reel for several seasons, and I think my credit got bounced up to some sort of producer by the end. But I might be wrong. I don't know. It may be right. And adapted would be right for Filmation because of my development. When I say I developed it, it was based on their live action Ghostbusters series. So adapted would absolutely be the correct credit for me to have. That's right. But I think I was a producer later on Ghostbusters. Certainly I was on. By the time it was Scheimer in the real Ghostbusters, I'm sure I was one of the some type of producer. I'd be shocked if I didn't have that credit by then. That's how I was functioning.
When and why did you ultimately leave Filmation?
Well, I've been good friends with Andy Hayward since I was a teenager, really close friends. And Andy's career had gone, he left Filmation. And I think I could say it. I think I'm safe to say this. I don't think he would mind. He was fired from Filmation while I was kept on. It was kind of an ironic situation. He was the one that was responsible for getting me my shot at Filmation. And they lied to me, and they kept me, and they didn't so much like him. I don't know if he was fired. That's probably not right, but they weren't terribly happy with his work, and I think he could sense that. And he was introduced to this guy named Jean Chalopin. Andy had a French girlfriend at the time in America, and he had learned to speak fluent French. And there was a French man named Jean Chalopin who had a company named Deke in Paris, and Jean wanted to infiltrate the American market and open an American branch of this company Deke, and was looking for somebody to run it and be in charge of it. And he was referred to Andy by Margaret Lesh, who was the head of NBC at the time, or maybe she'd already gone to Fox, but she was a huge executive in the kids network area, and she was a fan of Andy's, and she had referred Andy to Jean, and they clicked, and Jean hired Andy to basically open up this new company called Deke in America. And this was all while I was getting started at Filmation. During my years at Filmation, this was all going on. And Andy spent a year in Paris getting to know the company, getting to know Jean. And together they developed Inspector Gadget. And then they moved back to L.A. They opened up the Deke office and developed other things and sold Inspector Gadget, which debuted the same year that He-Man did, and started to get other work and were becoming a rising force in the industry. And during all this time, because I was, very good friends with Andy, he would call me all the time. We would talk regularly. We were very close friends. And he would want me to come to work for him. Once he got the company going in America, he would want me to come work for him. And he was still an employee himself at that time. He did not own the company. And he would offer me $100 more a week salary than I was making at Filmation. And I'd say, no way. I'd say, A, you'd be impossible to work with. B, because he would... And he was challenging. And B, it'll ruin our friendship. And C, I'm really happy here. I love the people I'm working for. I'm doing great. They've shown great confidence in me. And I'd be nuts to give this up, for $100 more a week. No way. And this, he'd make this offer to me regularly, like once a month. I mean, he's, one thing about Andy, he's an extremely persistent human being. That's one of his great gifts. He is unbelievably persistent. He would persistently make this offer to me, and I would persistently turn it down. And then come 1986, come summer 86, I guess it was, late summer of 86, Filmation had moved to a new building, beautiful, wonderful new building. I had Lou had given me this fantastic new office in the new building. It was so nice, nicest office I've ever had. And I was so happy there. I mean, I was closer than ever with Lou and John Grusd and Erica and everything, and Arthur. Everything was great. And I had so many friends at Filmation, and I had a girlfriend there at the time. My girlfriend was there. And he calls me the summer of 86, late 86, and he is in the process now of doing a leveraged buyout of the company from John. Prior to this, John was the boss, Jean Chalopin, and Andy was the second in command. And now he was buying the company from John, and he was now the boss, the owner, and they had a lot of work coming up. And Andy really, really wanted me basically as his, kind of his partner in crime, I have to say, because we were very, very close, and he knew what I could do, and he had already had confidence in me at the beginning, but he'd seen what I'd done over the last 6 years of Filmation. I had a really, really great track record now that he could sell on, and Andy's huge on selling, and he really, really values credits in his sales process, credits of personnel that he is part of his sales pitch always. And I had very, very sellable credits at this point, mainly He-Man, if nothing else. And plus our rapport, we were good friends. So he made me the veritable offer I couldn't refuse. I mean, it was a multiple of the money I'd been making, a big multiple of the money. I was going to become vice president of his company. I was going to get stock options, this, that, and the other. I mean, it was going to be a huge new challenge for me. I mean, one thing about Filmation is one of its great strengths was one of its weaknesses at the same time. Lou kept everybody at Filmation really insulated from the industry at large. I mean, with a rare exception, we didn't have to deal with all the fighting and greed and bad behavior and immorality and lack of ethics. And there's a lot of downside to the entertainment business, a lot of dark side to the entertainment business, and I don't mind saying that. Lou really kept his people. Lou detested all that stuff. He detested it, and he was an ethical person and a happy person and a person that prided himself in treating people well and believed that people should be treated well and always treated everybody incredibly well with incredible respect and kindness and decency. And so he really kept us insulated from that whole world of showbiz, and Filmation was just this happy family that basically everybody worked as a team, and we all got along, and we supported each other. And this was a building of 400 people. This was not a small company. It was a very large company, but Lou kept it a very happy place to work. A family, as I said. It really felt like a family, a huge family. And so Deke was a completely different story. So this was basically an opportunity to, A, make a lot more money, B, have a lot more responsibility, C, work with my close friend, not that Lou hadn't become my close friend, but, Andy had been a friend for a longer time, and sort of go out into the world, into the real world of showbiz. I mean, I was working in the entertainment industry, and it was great to be working as a writer and as a producer and as an executive, small time in Filmation, but it didn't really feel like the real world of entertainment. So those were all the appeals to me. And it was nonetheless, even with all of that being offered, and it was a lot, it was really a difficult decision for me to make. It was so hard for me to think about leaving Lou and Arthur, although I didn't work for Arthur anymore. But, these were the people that, as I said earlier, I kind of felt had picked me out of the gutter and made me a star, and I don't mean to the public, but I mean given me a chance to be successful and let me be successful. Already I had been successful beyond my dreams. I mean, just to have a television credit as a writer. My very first time I ever saw my name on TV back in 1980, that first year, was such a thrill. I never in a million years would have believed that I was going to see my name on television with the credit written by Robby London. I couldn't believe it. And so much more had happened since then. I developed series. I'd worked with people. Now I had feature films that so these men, Arthur and Lou, had just done such great things for me and had treated me so kindly, consistently, and thoroughly, and they were my friends. And the prospect of going to Lou and quitting and leaving was one of, maybe, arguably, the most difficult moment of my entire career to this day. I mean, when I kind of decided I was going to do it, telling Lou, it was like a divorce for me. I mean, it was like going to a wife who you knew still was madly in love with you and saying, I'm sorry, I'm not in love with you anymore, goodbye. And that's how it felt. And it was so hard. And Lou, this will tell you the kind of person he is. Instantly, he said, I knew without question this was going to happen, because he knew Andy too. He was friends with Andy through Andy's dad. Andy's dad and Lou were really close friends, and Lou had always been friends with Andy. That's why he gave Andy a job when Andy needed one. And so Lou knew Andy quite well, and he knew Andy and I were really close friends. And he saw the writing on the wall before I did, frankly. And he said, I knew this was going to happen. He didn't say it in an angry way. He said with a smile. He said, I knew it was going to happen. He said, you absolutely have to take this opportunity. It's a fantastic opportunity for you. I wouldn't have it any other way. And he said, how long can you stay? I said, I'll stay as long as you want, whatever you need. And he said, I want to throw you a big party when you leave. This is the kind of guy he is. There wasn't a hint of resentment or how dare you leave me or disloyal or any of the guilt. I was feeling so much guilt, and he completely assuaged me and put me at ease and understood and didn't blame me and genuinely wished me the best. And I have to say, we became even closer in the years afterwards. It wasn't just lip service. We stayed super close friends, as I say, for the rest of his life. Really closer. Because, as close as you are with somebody, when you're working with them and they're your boss, it's not the same as when you're friends with somebody and they're not your boss. And so we became, I'll never say peers, because I could not possibly in a million years ever consider myself a peer of Lou Scheimer. But we became more equal in the sense that I wasn't working for him and I was an executive at a big studio that wasn't his studio. And so I think he asked me to work there for 2 more weeks or something like that, something reasonable. And they did throw me a really nice party, and off I went to Deke, having to wear a tie to work for the first time in my life, which I fucking hated. That was one of the worst parts, was feeling like I had to wear a tie, which I eventually realized I didn't and stopped. But at the beginning, I felt I did, and I hated that. One of the reasons I never considered being an attorney when I was a kid, even though I think that was probably my real calling. I think I would have been a better attorney than almost anything else I've ended up doing. But one of the reasons I wasn't interested is the prospect of having to wear a tie every day was just, I didn't want to do it. Maybe that would be a good time, this would be a good time to end chapter 1 of this. What do you think?
I was going to say, with that, I think that's probably the best spot to end this section of this interview. And what a better note to end on than having to wear a fucking tie.